So thank you very much. Good morning again for being here in this seminar of the Cognitive Processing and Development Group. So I really honored today to receive Dr. June Gruber from the University of Colorado, Boulder, this morning. And let me just introduce our guest today by reading a little bit about her career. June Gruber is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience of the University of Colorado and director of the Positive Emotion and Psychopathology Lab. She received her PhD in clinical psychology and a BA in psychology from the University of California in Berkeley, and was previously an assistant professor of psychology at Yale University. Dr. Gruber has published over 100 articles and chapters and has edited 2 books, including the Oxford Handbook of Positive Emotion and Psychopathology and the Positive Emotion Integrating the Light Sides and Dark Sides. Her work has been recognized by the Association of Psychological Science Rising Star Award and the Janet Taylor Spencer Award for Transformative Early Career Contributions, the Society of Research in Psychopathology Early Career Award, and 2 NORSTAT Young Investigator Awards. Dr. Gruber teaches courses on emotion and psychopathology and co-writes a column for young scientists in science careers. Is the recipient of the 2020 Europe Outstanding Faculty Mentor Award and received an IMPART grant to co-lead a workshop on advancing unrepresented women in science. Dr. Gruber is actively engaged in science outreach and dissemination of science of emotion and mental health, including of a call to action centered on the mental health crisis sparked by COVID-19. So for me, it's a great honor to receive today Dr. June Gruber. June, thank you very much for this great opportunity. The stage is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction. I really appreciate it. What I thought would be important to share today is a bit of a big picture on thinking about how we can understand and importantly address student mental health, particularly the rising rate of mental health difficulties during and beyond the COVID pandemic. What I'll start out with today is just telling you a little bit about me. I know the kind introduction really said so much. That was so generous. Just briefly about the work we do and some of our advocacy for women in science, and then spending most of our time today just really coming to grapple with how we understand and tackle mental health challenges. This is a kind of a big picture effort of my lab, but also I think it's something that's a really important outreach activity we've gotten involved in and think everyone can really come to bring something to that conversation. So as mentioned, I direct the Positive Emotion and Psychopathology Lab. If you want to check out some of our work, this is our website, just gruberpeplab.com. And what we really look at is the link between our emotions and our mental health, and sometimes even how our positive feelings, joy, excitement, pride, wonder, sometimes if they're experienced too intensely or in the wrong context, they can also lead to mood difficulties. We look at people with a history of bipolar disorder, for example, and depression. In my lab, as mentioned, we've been trying to really bring the conversation about positive emotion and mental health to the forefront, to really bring it into the conversation, since for a long time, emotions were neglected in the study of mental illness and psychopathology. If you're interested in reading any of these books and want me to share an excerpt, just again, reach out to me at june.gruber@colorado.edu. I'm happy to talk more with you, but really better trying to understand our positive emotions by understanding how they both help our mental health, but like any emotion, they're not things we should be experiencing all the time or in every context either. My lab runs experimental studies in the laboratory. So we bring people into our lab who may have a history of psychiatric difficulties or may not, and we try to get them to feel emotions in the lab or elicit emotions by watching films, thinking about emotional memories in their own lives, or kind of completing computerized tasks, even interacting with other people. And while they're feeling emotions online in the moment, we measure their emotion across different channels. We call this a multimodal approach to emotions. We know that our emotions are things we experience qualitatively, so we get people to self-report their state and trait levels of emotions, both a variety of positive and negative emotions. For those of you interested in emotional behavior, we also videotape and record their facial expressions of emotion and code them using the kind of Paul Ekman facial action coding system. So students in our lab get trained to look at and recognize these really small and subtle contractions of muscles in the face and learn how to code their intensity that then map onto different kinds of emotional displays we have as human beings, as another way to understand the ways our emotions kind of manifest themselves. We also look at physiological responses non-invasively. So we do things kind of tapping into different domains of both central and peripheral physiology. We do studies with neuroimaging, EEG, some neuroendocrine samples, and then in my lab, we also non-invasively have sensors where we can measure what's happening in the body as people are experiencing emotions, what's happening with their heart rate, their skin conductance, the amount you sweat from your palms, their breathing. These are things that while we are living emotions, our body is responding online. So it's really fun to study emotions because you get to do a lot of different things and look at a lot of different ways to measure them. So it's never boring, and it's always exciting to watch what happens in your mind, in your face, and in your body while you're experiencing an emotion or trying to regulate it. And one thing I mentioned, I would just say as a note, is that my lab, especially over the past few years, myself as a woman in science, and I have many wonderful students in my lab, and also since becoming a mother about 6 years ago, have taken a lot of time to really also have kind of a bent to our lab that's focused on public advocacy about women in the sciences. This is a book that my lab, we did a reading club last summer during the pandemic, the book Lab Girl, where we really kind of opened our minds to thinking more critically about gender biases in the field of sciences. And this was a quote from Lab Girl that really stood out to me, where the author, who's a scientist who studies plants and trees, she's quite amazing. She noted in this book that she said, "I have been told that I am intelligent, and I have been told that I am simple-minded. I have been told that I am trying too much, to do too much, and I have been told that what I have done amounts to very little. I have been told that I can't do what I want because I am a woman, and I have been told that I have only been allowed to do what I have done because I am a woman. I have been told that I can have eternal life, and I have been told that I will burn myself out into an early death. I have been admonished for being too feminine, and I have been distrusted for being too masculine. I have been warned that I am far too sensitive, and I have been accused of being heartlessly callous. But I was told all of these things by people who can't understand the present or see the future any better than I can. Such recurrent pronouncements have forced me to accept that because I am a female scientist, nobody knows what the hell I am, and it has given me the delicious freedom to make it up as I go along. I don't take advice from colleagues, and I try not to give it. When I am pressed, I resort to these two sentences: you shouldn't take this job too seriously, except for when you should." And I thought that really conveyed the powerful double standards women often face in the sciences. And these kind of anecdotes don't come up just with one woman scientist here or there. And in fact, these kinds of experiences and first-person accounts were things that many of my women colleagues in psychology and neuroscience shared. Even though we studied really different topics, we were working at very different institutions, different parts of the world, we all came together to write this paper called The Future of Women in Psychological Science that came out last year, where nearly 60 of us decided that what we needed to do was to have psychology and neuroscience actually join the conversation on gender parity and disparity, and really ask ourselves, where does our field stand? I think there's a lot of assumption that psychology in particular is better off than other fields, the quote hard sciences, computer science, but yet when we look really closely, we see that our field faces many of the same barriers. And in fact, there's a lot of important research that needs to be done. It was a labor of love to get this paper out. And since then, we've been trying to share it as widely as possible. So I shared with you a link to an interview that APS, the Association for Psychological Science, did with a subset of us who are authors. It says, under the cortex, the kind of story behind this paper, The Future of Women in Psych Science. And I'm happy to talk about any of this with anyone who's interested. But just as a little kind of overview, what we really tried to do in this paper was to outline 10 important issues that may be impacting the future of women in our field, and then think about what might be the kind of levels or processes that may be driving them. So we tried to really take a serious scientific approach to reviewing the literature and say, here's areas where the issues are quite pronounced, and here's some areas where gender disparities have actually done much better over the years. So you can take a look at the paper. If you want to email me, I'm happy to share it with you, because I think in many ways it's meant to be generative, to open up conversations and really think critically and reflect on where we are, and we chart a path forward of where we can go from here. And also my colleague Leah Somerville, who's at Harvard, and I wrote a column as well, and this is freely available online. I'll happily share my slides if you want to check it out, where we think about what are some trouble spots facing women in science, but importantly, not just outlining the issues, but starting to think really proactively about how we can tackle them. So those are things that are deep and near to my heart, and that really sort of permeate all the work we do in my lab, and that we think about as a field, to make not just the science that we do interesting and important, but to make the way we're doing science and the way we're treating our peers and women and underrepresented members of our community with equality and civility and kindness. So happy to talk about that anytime. And today, the piece of work that I want to share with you is a kind of big picture lens and thinking about the role of psychological science and cognitive science in tackling student mental health. So when I first got interested in this work, in particular on young adults, kind of who might first just be starting out in their lives or maybe in college, I noticed that there was a really fascinating thing about a period of life we call emerging adulthood, between 18 and 25. And I thought what was so perplexing about it is that it was a real portrait of what seemed to be a duality, almost like a dizzying duality of, on the one hand, during this time of emerging adulthood, we'd characterize it as a period of really profound resilience and growth. We know that emerging adults, or what we often call young adults, you're experiencing growth and you're developing your sense of identity and self, having newfound autonomy and agency and independence for the first time for many individuals. From a cognitive neuroscience perspective, we're seeing a lot of really elegant maturity in our cognition and executive control capacities. And what's really interesting is if you look at surveys on how people rate their satisfaction with life or well-being overall, and you look at this cross-sectionally across the lifespan, this period of emerging adult actually shows general increases in well-being on average. And I found this really perplexing because at the same time we're seeing all these wonderful capacities for resilience, growth, maturity, well-being, prior to the pandemic, we knew that there was a mental health crisis emerging among a lot of college and university campuses. These are statistics now outdated, but even then, we were struck by the rates of mental health challenges. These are just some sample descriptives, noting that among college students, 1 in 3 were reporting prolonged periods of depression. Half of students rated their mental health below average or poor. 1 in 7 students engaged in abnormally reckless behavior. So this is the kind of risky behavior that can put their health and safety or that of their peers or friends in danger. And 1 in 4 students were reporting having suicidal thoughts or feelings. So my lab joined this conversation thinking, how can we study emotion and mental health, how can that join the conversation? Because at this time, prior to COVID, we saw a paper come out noting that 1 in 3 college freshmen, first-year college students worldwide, are reporting what we call a clinically significant mental health disorder. So this is meeting kind of the kind of clinical cutoff for a kind of serious psychiatric challenge. Time magazine picked up on this also, noting that record numbers of college students are seeking treatment for depression and anxiety, but schools simply can't keep up. And on my campus here at the University of Colorado Boulder, and as the many campuses are sort of also kind of joining the conversation to note that student mental health is a really critical and growing issue. So I give this background to emphasize what seemed to be a very vulnerable mental health space for many young adults, and looking at those who might be attending college or university campus. And it seemed just profoundly concerning that while this was happening, unexpectedly COVID hit. And we presented young adults with some of the most profound, serious, and acute stressors we could. Social isolation, uncertainty about the future, anxiety-related concerns about their health or the health of their family members, academic stressors with a lot of students no longer able to continue their studies or being sort of abruptly forced to online modalities that may be unfeasible or impractical. And the Washington Post came out with this article noting that it seemed that coronavirus made what seemed to be already, quote, stressed college students even more anxious and depressed. There's work now just coming out in my lab. I'll just share briefly, has just completed our longitudinal kind of study looking at students before and during COVID. But I thought I would share this initial findings that came out from the American College Health Association and the Healthy Minds Network, who did some initial studies sampling 18,000 college students. And they compared data from fall 2019, so pre-COVID, and spring 2020, where we really had the acute outbreak, lockdowns, kind of the initial phase of COVID for many parts of the world. And what was interesting in their study is that they found that indeed these two domains that I've highlighted in kind of a red rectangle did seem to get worse from fall in green to March and May during COVID in dark blue. It did indeed seem that students were reporting greater symptoms of depression, and on the far right, reporting that their mental health, that's the MH, seemed to impair their academics. Not surprising. If you're feeling more depressed, it's not surprising it might impair your academic performance. But their findings weren't so simple either. It didn't suggest that everything was seeming to get worse during COVID. And in fact, some things seem to either stay the same or maybe decrease. So in particular, substance use and binge drinking seem to actually decrease during COVID. And there's different accounts for why that might be the case. It certainly could be that a lot of the social drinking that may happen during college was simply not something that was even feasible during lockdown. Other domains, as we see here, actually, suicidal ideation, anxiety, and flourishing either showed small decreases or remained relatively stable. Now, this is during just the acute phase, and it really just suggests that the landscape of mental health challenges are more nuanced than we may think, and we have a lot to study and a lot to understand. But one thing is clear, students are reporting increased stress and increased distress as well. So with this notion of we're in a kind of moving landscape where COVID is far from done, many parts of the world are still profoundly being impacted, where mental and physical health is really in a crisis situation. What can we do when it comes to the mental health piece of this? A lot of attention, rightly so, is being focused on physical health and doing our best globally to try to disseminate vaccines. While that is happening in parallel, we need to also attend to the mental health of individuals. And I'll focus today on thinking about what we can do about student mental health, but I think of these kinds of maybe ideas as ones that we can generalize to the community at large. But when we think, just as an example, about student mental health, I'll present kind of 4 big picture things that we've been working on in our lab and on campus, and hopefully they'll provide at least some initial kind of thoughts about how to move forward. And I think of these as complementing, of course, disseminating mental health resources, remote-based therapy, psychiatric medications as appropriate. I think of these as ideas that supplement traditional, means of therapeutic care. Sort of what can we all do as members of a campus community, whether we're students, instructors, researchers, administrators, how can we collectively come together to talk about and try to address the student mental health crisis that's emerging during COVID? One of the pieces that I found most important during all of this, as we're seeing mental health challenges sort of on the rise, is to change our narrative and our conversation, and most importantly, our mindset around mental illness, and with an important lens on destigmatization. I taught a class last fall, a large undergraduate course about mental health. It was called Abnormal Psychology. And the idea was to teach students about different clinical disorders, depression, anxiety, PTSD. And I really found that while we're doing this in the midst of COVID, that one of the most important lessons that I could try to convey is not so much memorizing the criteria and symptoms for different disorders, but really cultivating a different mindset around psychopathology, towards compassion and destigmatization. There's a beautiful book by Stephen Hinshaw, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, called The Mark of Shame: Stigma of Mental Illness and an Agenda for Change. And I actually made that a required reading in my class, because I felt that if we're going to talk about mental health and illness, we need to understand why it is still so very stigmatized, and begin to understand the roots of it, and how we can move forward. So I think he's fantastic, and he has a lot of freely available lectures online on YouTube, Steve Hinshaw. But this book of his is really one of the most powerful I read, that also explains why the stigma of mental illness traces so far back, and how it encompasses our feelings, our attitudes, and our behaviors, and requires important hard work to overcome. One piece that he talks about, this is Steve Hinshaw, who also wrote a book about his father's life history with severe mental illness. He has this important piece that one step in the midst of all this is to normalize human mental illness, to put a face to it. He says, indeed, we are a narrative storytelling species. Revealing our own histories and understanding those of others can really help us appreciate the humanity in all of our fellow individuals. And I think that's a beautiful way to put it. What I try to do with my students is to show them faces and people who have experienced and continue to experience symptoms of mental illness. Ellen Sachs has a very popular TED Talk. This is a screenshot from her TED Talk. She's also the author of a book called The Center Cannot Hold. She is a law professor and has a history of severe schizophrenia and psychosis. And her book, The Center Cannot Hold, is a very powerful memoir through her journey. And importantly, in telling her story, she's normalizing the face of what schizophrenia looks like, and trying to change our language around it. One quote from her that I found really beautiful was, she said, "We must portray people with mental illness sympathetically, and portray them in all the richness and depth of their experience as people and not as diagnoses." So we don't call people a schizophrenic. We say someone who is a person that might happen to have this history or these symptoms of schizophrenia. My students in my courses have really worked hard on this campaign to change how we talk about mental health, both to normalize that we all go through mental distress and difficulties, and that's perfectly acceptable and may even be a catalyst or reason many of us get into the field in the first place, but which is rarely discussed. And importantly, to destigmatize the language we use. One of my students started a campaign called #StopTheCrazyTalk. And in this, she really created a beautiful video where she talked about the language we use, calling someone crazy, calling someone "you're so bipolar," or "that person is totally schizo," and that these become part of our everyday language. They're very damaging, and they're also very inaccurate with what mental illness actually looks like. I think this would be beautiful to do a campaign across different languages and the different ways that different languages, English, Spanish, like how we talk about mental health, and whether it's subtle or not, that those can perpetuate stigmatizing views we have about mental health. So thinking carefully when you talk about mental health of yourself or someone else, or hear someone talking about someone struggling, the way that they're using the words. I think importantly too, if we're going to destigmatize mental illness, we need to, and I think this is something we're not often trained to do as scientists, whether we're neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, or clinical scientists, we're not trained very well with how to communicate with the public. So I think it's great you're taking this course and it's being posted on YouTube, because I think often we stay in our classrooms, we stay in our labs, and we don't share the insights we have with the public. And in a way, we have the power to change the public perception of mental health, and we need to engage in the conversation. On the left, my colleague and I, John Rottenberg, he's a depression researcher at the University of South Florida, and he has a beautiful book about depression and sort of coming out about his own history of depression and how that motivated him to become the scientist he is today. So he's done a lot of wonderful campaign work with the public. He and I wrote a paper last spring, where we talked about flattening the mental health curve as the next big coronavirus challenge, that it's important that we communicate with the public, because if we don't, who will, about why mental health is important to pay attention to, that we need to study it more. We need to ask people, students, what they're experiencing if we're going to change our public perception. And along these notes, this is just a kind of a side note of professional development. For those of you who are interested in thinking about how can I communicate with the public, and you can and you should, Dave DeSteno and I created a free series online. The link is at the bottom, through APS, the Association for Psychological Science. When COVID hit, it shut down the annual APS conference. And at that conference, we had originally planned a symposium where we'd bring in people to talk about, like, how do you do a podcast, or how do you do, a book or an op-ed, like for a major media outlet? How do you blog? Like, how do you communicate with the public in these ways we're not often trained to do in the classroom or in a lab? And when the conference got shut down, we were able to interview these people over Zoom and record their brief 15-minute interviews. So you can hear one of the senior editors of the New York Times, James Ryerson, talk about, like, how do you write an op-ed? Tanya Lombroso used to do a blog for NPR, and just what that was like, or if you want to do a podcast. So if that's something you're interested in, or even just want to learn how people do it, these are freely available conversations about how to think about those skills that anyone can watch. So they're up there on YouTube. And again, if you want the link, I'll resend it to you happily. From my own perspective, I felt like, as a clinical psychologist and a scientist who studies mental health, I felt during the COVID that we weren't doing enough to really talk to the masses, to share the science of mental health, discoveries, challenges, treatments. And so while I was teaching these classes last fall and felt like the world was ignoring our really growing mental health crisis, I created this free series called #TalkMentalIllness. And it's a free series of about 30 interviews with public health figures in mental health, like Temple Grandin, who's a public health figure and face her autism. Some of our leading scientists talking about different clinical disorders, talking about racism and the impact of that on mental health, and also thinking about global mental health and a path forward. I'll show you a brief 1-minute overview of this series, but it's freely available on YouTube, and it's also online on Coursera, which is a platform for kind of the dissemination of kind of a broader course for the public that you can freely audit. So I'll just give you a 1-minute flavor of it, but if you want to take it or watch some of these interviews, they're there for anyone, and certainly I hope that they're useful. So I'll just play this real quick, and you can get a feel for this.
I'm June Gruber, a clinical psychologist, professor, and educator at the University of Colorado Boulder, and director of this unique Talk Mental Illness series. Like so many of my colleagues, I was unprepared for the wave of mental health challenges that would face our society in 2020. From COVID-19 and the devastating economic impacts of the pandemic, to racial justice protests and widespread natural disasters, our current societal moment presents unprecedented mental health concerns. For this reason, I created the Talk Mental Illness Expert Interview Series. You'll have the opportunity to hear from over 30 experts in mental health, spanning different domains in psychology and neuroscience research and practice, as well as award-winning public figures and leaders. I've curated these interviews about mental illness into 5 core themes. This Talk Mental Illness series is part of a broader educational mission to share the science of mental illness with both students and the public, both locally and globally.
So again, it's free to audit. If you want to take a peek, you can just go to coursera.org/learn and /talk mental illness. And I felt this was outside of the work we normally do as scientists in our lab, but I felt that this was a kind of a public health responsibility, that we need to get the word out. We need to share science. We need to disseminate the face of mental health during COVID and really get people talking about it and change the way we view the landscape of mental health and mental illness. I also think it's important to think about how you can destigmatize mental health in your own lab or class. And I wrote a brief column about this. I've been very passionate about these issues, especially since COVID hit. about ways that instructors and professors, we must support the mental health of the students in our class. We must advocate for mental wellness, support our students, stay connected to them as much as we can when we're all doing everything over Google Hangouts or Zoom or whatever laptop interface you're using. Being as flexible as we can, so not holding on to rigid deadlines when the world is so unstable and uncertain. And when we can as students, and students who study the mind and the brain, try to find meaning. Are there important things we can learn about the mind and brain right now that are lessons we can take forward to create a better world and society? And I think importantly too, in addition to supporting students and helping provide mental health referrals and them getting the treatment they need, to also empower them with the science of happiness. So this is, the science of happiness can be parallel to treatments that someone may be seeking for anxiety or depression by giving people insights about what makes humans well. So as humans, we think we know what makes us happy, right? Grades or money or status or things. But often we are wrong. We miswant. We want things that we think will make us happy, but often they will not. And rather than trying to guess or be wrong about predicting what's going to make us happy, we can actually look to the science for answers. And the good news is a lot of this burgeoning science of happiness and wellness is freely available. It's just a great era we're in, with so much wealth of information being freely available. There's a wonderful course at Berkeley. It's the first massive course on the science of happiness. So you can go to greatergood.berkeley.edu/happiness course. And the Greater Good Science Center, which is directed by Dr. Keltner, who's a fantastic professor at UC Berkeley, created this course. I'm going to share with you also like a brief intro to the course. And I recommend checking it out too. These are free resources anyone can look at and anyone can learn from.
Imagine that scientists have created a happiness machine, a machine that could make you as happy as you'd like with just the push of a button. Would you use it? Would you push the button? I've asked that question of my students for years, and most of them say no. Most of them want to find true happiness on their own in a genuine way. But how do you do that?
That's where science comes in. For the past decade, researchers have been developing a roadmap for the pursuit of happiness, suggesting, for instance, that roughly 40% of our happiness is determined not by our genes, but by our daily activities. It's up to you. I'm Emiliana Simon-Thomas.
And I'm Dr. Keltner. Here at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, we've been part of this scientific movement to identify the sources of a happy, meaningful life. And we've made some valuable discoveries. And we would like to share these findings with you to help you unlock the secrets to a happier life, healthier relationships, stronger communities.
That's where this course comes in. The Science of Happiness is the first MOOC to teach this research, with presentations from some of the world's top experts on the subject, like Sonia Luber-Mirsky, John Kabat-Zinn, Paul Ekman, and Barbara Fredrickson. They'll join us in covering topics like mindfulness, compassion, and gratitude.
Together, we'll tour this field that some call positive psychology. We'll explore why writing down things you're grateful for can strengthen your immune system and improve your sleep. A meditation can actually change your brain for the better, and why spending money on others is actually better for your happiness than spending on yourself.
Along the way, we'll devote special attention to the links between happiness and human connection, kindness, a commitment to something greater than yourself.
But we're going to do more than tell you about the science of happiness. We're going to help you experience it firsthand. Each week, you'll try out research-tested methods for boosting happiness and strengthening your meaningful connection to others. And you'll be able to track your progress over time and discuss it all with your classmates.
So please join us for the Science of Happiness. We'll put the secrets to happiness at your fingertips with just the click of a button.
There's also other resources in the Science of Happiness by Professor Laurie Santos at Yale. She has another Science of Wellbeing class that's free on Coursera and has a popular podcast called The Happiness Lab that you can find on Apple Podcasts, where she does regular interviews with different public figures and scientists talking about challenges and insights, especially during COVID, that we can really leverage the science of happiness to help us address and overcome. I also think it's important that as scientists, I know there's cognitive scientists here, psychologists, neuroscience students, that when these things happen, we engage with them. we pivot, we pause our research, we pivot towards trying to address societal moments. This is what my students and I decided to do. When we saw what was happening with COVID, we know we needed to immediately shift our priorities and really tackle the real world problems facing us. We launched what we call the Emerge Project, which we were lucky to get support from some of the divisions on our campus here at the University of Colorado Boulder to work on recruiting students to participate in a paid survey, because we knew that if we were going to actually try to learn something about student mental health, we needed to reach out to the students themselves. So this was an article when we were working on first starting this study, where we said that we want students, them, to tell us how they're feeling so that we can have a better pulse on the mental health of students on campus. This is a timeline of where we're at right now. We had been working on this study with a large sample of college students starting in fall 2018. We were running it again in fall 2019 when COVID hit, and we had run about 800 students at that time. And what we decided to do was to look at changes within these students during what we call acute COVID, spring 2020, and now what we're calling this kind of chronic and enduring phase of COVID, where a lot of the mental health challenges are really starting to worsen as we're fatigued and coping with chronic stressors now for over a year. So we worked with students fall 2020, and we actually just completed our last wave of data collection this spring. So our hope is now we can start beginning to answer some of the pressing questions that really face what is going on with students and what we can do to better understand what happens when a very horrible and unfortunate, almost a naturalistic experiment in social isolation and massive uncertainty, what that does to the human mind and how that impacts how we interact with others and fare ourselves. So in that study that we're just now going to start looking at, and that we'd love to partner with others, we'd love to partner with colleagues like you in Mexico so that we can really better understand challenges facing young adults across the globe. We've been looking at domains of mental health, social networks, especially with young adults not being able to socialize in the ways they used to and that are so vital for development and well-being. Decision-making and reward, and different domains of emotion experience, regulation, and happiness. When it comes to mental health, we've really taken a broad-based approach. So we study bipolar disorder and depression in my lab. In this project, we've really expanded beyond to get domains of mood, suicidality, substance abuse, psychosis, stress, anxiety. We have a student interested in psychopathy and healthy living. Not just to give you a sample of, we're really trying to be broad in how we approach it. We've also looked at social connection because this is such an important part of COVID, where we've been physically isolated from the normal social rituals of our everyday life. We've been measuring social support, identity, loneliness, and social networks. This is asking students to name the number of friends that they have, and then to ask of those friends, how many can they go to share good emotional news or bad emotional news. So both kind of the quantity and quality of their social lives. These are some measures of social networks, just to give you an example, at our university. So we asked them, since you arrived, who are the classmates you've been with most often for informal social activities, and to list as many of them as you can. We also look at things like, of these friends, who do you go to share good news with? Who do you turn to when something bad happens? And who is most similar to you? So these social network slides were developed by my wonderful incoming graduate student, Stevie Ibani, who's interested in looking at the role of social networks in mental health and what a critical part of our mental health the social world plays. We're also looking at domains of cognition of interest to all of you, reward, and the ability to regulate emotions. We've had some experiences partnering. We have several collaborators within the US, Canada, UK, and India doing some of this, but we really would love to expand further. So if this is something any of you might be interested in, please reach out. It's a remote-based survey, which is amenable to COVID right now through Qualtrics, as we really try to broaden our understanding of mental health, emotion, and decision-making, and social networks around the globe, ideally. And finally, and then we can pause for questions, I think really at the end of the day, when we're thinking about COVID and mental health, we should think about how neuroscience and psychological science ultimately can make a better world. This is a special series I edited at Perspectives on Psych Science, a journal in the field, asking ourselves in this field, how can psychological science actually contribute to a healthier, happier, and more sustainable world? And I love this quote by William James, which says, "Act as if what you do makes a difference because it does." And I always try to think about this myself and remind students that what we are doing, we're in such a unique field, we really can make a difference. We really can understand and impact the real world lives of people. So not to forget that, and always to be keeping that in mind when you're studying the brain or the mind or behavior, and think forward about what you can do to make it a better place and space. So with that, I'll pause, and this is my lab. That's my oldest son in the picture, and then our lab during COVID over Zoom. So if you want to reach out to ask questions, my email address is june.gruber@colorado.edu, and our lab website, which I think I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, is www.gruberpeplab.com. I'm always happy to talk about questions and really just explore an important space together.
Perfect. Thank you very much, June, for this great talk. I think it's a very interesting topic, and this is necessary in this time that we are living all around the globe. Unfortunately, we had the news from India that are spreading, and Colombia, Brazil, that is very difficult, the situation. So I think it's crucial, this moment, to think, to reflect on this. And I would like to ask some questions that I have in the chat, and also remind you that you have the form for your attendance. So Manuel is asking, good morning. First of all, congratulations and thank you for your work. It is very interesting and necessary. I have a question. Is the impact of COVID-19 related to syndromes such as burnout?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you asked that, because there's been a lot of recent conversation of what is COVID burnout? Is it something distinct from depression? And it's been a really interesting conversation, because it seems to be that a lot of the symptoms that we're describing, especially now, we're on a year or more during COVID, with maybe some hope in sight, or maybe things are quite a bit worse, as you're mentioning, with a lot of our communities and friends in Brazil and India and many places of the world, where it's as bad as it was at the beginning, if not worse. And I think what the kind of literature is pointing to answer your question is that it seems to be indeed a lot of the symptoms of burnout, fatigue, trouble concentrating, low energy, kind of a lack of pleasure in things that we might normally enjoy, actually seems to look a lot like depression. And we're thinking that it might actually be more akin to depression than a distinct syndrome in and of itself. And it's not surprising that many of us would be having these experiences. I say that the experience of not just negative feelings, but anxiety and depression, we think of these as things that are infrequent or rare. They're not, for one. Actually, they're quite common in the general population, but I think in a way they're entirely understandable and normative in this time of like chronic stress and exhaustion that our minds and bodies were not designed to have to, endure and bear.
Yes, and I think that this have to be related with the second question that he has, that in that sense, it could be protective or preventive factors. What could be the preventive or protective factors?
Yeah, so we're thinking a lot about this, and I'll just say that the data is still out in terms of understanding better. But there's a few things that I think we're drawing from the literature that can help buffer us. I think one critical piece is to foster social connection in whatever way possible. We know that one of the biggest buffers or protective factors are social connections with others. And I know that it can't look the same right now as it might normally, but there's a sense in which to kind of foster contact, whether that's in person or remotely, even with a small number of people you're very close with, to kind of keep that up, even if it's like a weekly call, because it's that social connection, feeling of closeness, that as a human species, we're very much a social species. So it's not surprising that without that, we suffer quite a bit. And so we, as much as we can, to maintain the kind of regular social contact we can with people, even if it's in a different form, is critically important to our well-being. Importantly, too, second is the kind of approach we take to our emotions. It's easy to become overwhelmed or be frustrated or even criticize yourself for feeling a lot of negative feelings of anger, of sadness, of anxiety. But one, I think, is to cultivate an attitude of acceptance, that in fact these emotions, I teach classes on emotions, and the first thing I tell people is that emotions are the things that keep us alive, even negative emotions, and they're actually, what they're doing is they're giving us information about the world. And so to see your emotions as a really important source of information about the world, and not trying to suppress them or push them out of your mind or try to replace them with positive feelings that may be artificial in that moment, is really important, because certainly we're going to feel sad if we're losing contact with people we care about. Certainly we're going to feel frustrated when we see a lot of social injustices that are coming to light during COVID in the world. But to just accept them, that they're giving us information. And importantly, to take a stance of, we call this kind of mindfulness-based approaches, to foster an attitude of acceptance, of curiosity, and to know that our emotions will pass. They're almost like waves of an ocean. They get really intense and they can peak, but they won't last forever. It's just not the way emotions work. So I often say it's, fostering social connection, and also adopting as much as we can an attitude of acceptance and of mindfulness. And as someone who studies positive emotions, I say, it would be almost odd or unusual to be feeling joyous and exuberant right now. Like, that might actually be concerning, because that's not giving us an accurate read on what's happening in our world. This is an unusual circumstance, to say the least. And so as much as we can, the final thing I would say, we know from psychology, it seems so simple, but some of the simplest rituals of just taking care of our bodies, sleeping and eating and moving our bodies, those seem like such basic things, but more and more we know that they are essential to sort of staving off mental health challenges. Just sleeping enough hours every night and moving your body, even if it's just like a walk around your neighborhood, that it's very hard to combat overwhelming anxiety and depression if we're not just taking care of our bodies in the most basic kind of fundamental way. And we know sleep deprivation makes it more difficult for us to regulate our emotions. It puts us at greater risk for depression and other clinical symptoms, as does exercise. It's a very simple intervention that can play a role too in beginning to combat depression.
Yeah, I agree. Totally, I agree. I have another question from Mitzi. Good morning. Thank you very much for your time. It's such an honor to hear you. I have a question. In addition to using appropriate language, what other ways to work to destigmatize mental illness?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mitzi. And I certainly recommend that book I mentioned by Steve Hinshaw, the book on stigma, The Mark of Shame. And he talks about some of the things I shared with you are also insights that come from his book. But I think importantly, kind of a campaign against mental illness, there's an individual level of the things we can do, right? But I think there's also a way in which we need, one, he talks about the role of media and the way mental health and mental illness is portrayed in the media, that it's a tool that could be used for good. But if we look at some of the ways it's portrayed in shows and movies, it can actually do quite a bit of harm. So there's a way in which we need to think about getting the word out to destigmatize in ways people see, which now everyone's watching YouTube or, looking at Facebook or whatever. So I think some of my students have worked on like a campaign in kind of social media realms to change the face of things. But importantly, a lot of this too is going to come at like a policy level. Right? What are the resources we provide for people who need support and who need treatment? And how do we really, kind of change our government to care more about mental health and illness and speak about it in a way that supports people and doesn't treat it differently than physical illness, right? So I think there's a level too that we need to do kind of social advocacy work as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I have another question from Dr. Shlomit. I say hello from here. How can psychologists prepare our students and society to the post-COVID world?
It's a great question. I think we're starting to think a lot about this, which is on the one hand a positive thing that we can think about a world post-COVID, right? It's something that, for a long time we didn't know what that world or when that world might occur. And hopefully it's on the horizon as vaccine distribution starts increasing. I think there's a lot we're learning. I think one of the things is sort of, I think of, helping people gradually acclimate back to the world before in a way. And that's not easy. Transition is hard. And I think for many people, being at home has taught them about certain aspects of their lifestyle. They don't want to go back to the status quo or the way it was before. So I think moving forward, we have to, one, accept that people are going to want more flexible lives where they can be at home and not be at home and sort of work with people. But I think importantly, as part of a post-COVID world, we can't go back and assume things are normal or that they would go back to the way they were before. Our lives are forever changed. And I think we've been importantly forced to raise awareness to things that were being sort of pushed under the rug before, including mental health and illness, and that people, even if the physical virus gets under control, when it does, the mental health repercussions are going to last a long time. I always talk about that's the wave that we're going to be grappling with for quite some time. And I think a post-COVID world needs to have important and appropriate mental health resources in place. People have gone through trauma. People have had their sense of certainty and stability disrupted. Young adults have missed major life milestones that they will never get back. Graduating, from school, just all kinds of things. And people have lost, had people who they loved who died. These are things that are going to take a long time for people to process, and we need to give a lot of space for people to have that time to do it.
Yeah. I agree. Yes. So I have a final question for my own, and we are very close to the end of the session. And I thank you very much again, June, for this great opportunity. And as you mentioned, I was thinking about what you say about sleeping. Myself, I suffer from a sleeping apnea, and I know that it's very difficult to stay concentrated and to memorize the things and always be ready for your classes and everything. So I think it's very important, the thing that you mentioned. And in that sense, I have my question, and I'm going to ask you for a final reflection. My question is, for example, you hear the news, you hear about the India, the new virus, the new kind of virus from the COVID, and you know that we have all the vaccines in the different countries, but the process is kind of slow in some places. But what can we do with the students that are already tired from, for example, these courses online, and they have been, some of them quitting school? So what can we do in that sense in order to prevent all the news and all the things that they hear in the media?
In some ways, I think maybe it might be good to disconnect, right? A little while. We're finding that, social media has, its light and very dark sides. And I think one piece of it, though, that can really be maladaptive is when we're engaging in it in a way that's creating a sense of social comparison, creating a sense of uncertainty, augmenting stressors in our lives. On the one hand, I might say to take a break from social media and find real meaningful connection with the people in your life. And also if you're able to get out, there's work by Dacher Keltner and others at Berkeley about getting out in nature and taking walks, kind of taking a break from this digital overload many people have had, and trying to just sort of reconnect and reclaim your sense of self before trying to come back to what you want life to look like for you.
Perfect. And I would like to ask you something that I always ask for my speakers for the final session. As I told you in the beginning, this seminar, the idea is to visualize and to also to see the work of female scientists around the world. So it's very important for us, the work that you did with your colleagues about the future of women in psychological science. So I would like to give that you can give us a message, a final reflection of, in this time of the pandemic and the future world that we don't know what's going to happen, to stay motivated, to do research, to stay connected with the people, to look for example, your field of research. What can we do in order to stay motivated?
I think one of the things during this time of immense challenges and stressors and injustices in the world that I found really helpful is to realize that we're in a unique position in the sciences, particularly psychology, to really tackle questions that matter and have meaning, about women's experiences in the world in science, about mental health, about well-being, and that as much as it may feel hard to do much right now, when you can, I think if you can get involved in this kind of field and research, that you actually really are able to make a difference. Like no time before in our field can we take what we learn and really share it with the world and make it better. So that feels, in a way, as dark as it is, it's a point of meaning and inspiration too, that you can do something that matters more now than ever.